welcome everybody to today's session of Tax and Development on the tax treatment of ODA, our donors meeting their commitments. We are very excited to have a range of experts and perspectives to provide insights on this discussion today. Very important. Joe and I will provide an overview of recent work on our Transparency Hub on the tax treatment of ODA, provide some updates on that. We have an excellent array of panelists, as mentioned. We have from the Netherlands, Valerie Nordholz, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Ashima Neb from the Platform for Collaboration on Tax. From Ferdi, Gregor Roda Graziosi, who will present the findings of their new report and shed light on some until now unknown statistics regarding the tax treatment of ODA. So we're very excited that you can all join us. Thank you very much for hanging in there till the end of the day with us. I've taken over the introduction so that Joe can take a slight reprieve. So I guess without further ado, we'll get started then with the opening presentation. And I think Joe, if you don't mind pulling up the PowerPoint, that would be great.
Is that there now?
Yep, perfect. Great. So today we see that the financing for sustainable development context, taking a step back, looking at the holistic picture of all of the available resources, public, private, domestic, international, available to developing countries, are under extreme constraints and pressures. We've seen in our Global Outlook on Financing for Sustainable Development, published late last year, that in fact the gap to finance the SDGs increased by at least 56% in 2020. This was due primarily to the drop in available government revenue, which shrank by 22%. We see, of course, that all of the other resources, external resources that are available to developing countries, many of them took a strong hit as well. FDI flows, for example, fell very sharply by 20%. We see that official development assistance, while it did grow to meet to respond to growing demands, it is now stretched, and with inflationary pressures, is forced to do more with the same amount. So we see that there are growing constraints on all sources of financing, that there's a need to look across the interlinkages between the different resources. So we know that this is not that no single source of financing is going to be sufficient to finance the sustainable development goals, and our work connecting across the tax and aid communities works particularly looking at how we can raise revenue and also ensure that ODA is used effectively. Next slide, please. So we see that the tax incentives for investment are under increasing scrutiny. I think we've seen this in previous sessions as well. Of course, tax incentives are used frequently around the world to promote investment in specific activities. The tax incentives can attract investment and have positive spillovers, but they can also reduce revenue raising capacity. They can create economic distortions, and we see that the efficiency of these tax-related investment incentives is coming under increased scrutiny. In some instances, we've seen in the past studies that have shown how in many developing countries, for example, tax incentives can be redundant. We've seen that in recent studies as well, that there can be a very big difference among the effective tax rates for the taxpayers in the same sector or country. So this creates complications. There's a lot of complexity with these incentive schemes, which impedes understanding, and in this lack of transparency to be able to properly assess the cost can also undermine efforts to identify the wasteful or redundant incentives. Of course, we must mention the global minimum tax agreement, which of course led to the landmark Pillar 2, which sets an effective corporate tax rate, minimum global tax rate of 15%. And this seeks to respond to the concern regarding profit shifting, and I think that this is demonstrating even more the importance of looking at the tax incentives for investment. Next slide, please. But at the same time, investment isn't the only source of financing that's impacted by tax incentives. ODA, official development assistance, is also incentivized to some extent by tax treatment. And we see that in some of the poorest countries, the least developed countries, ODA represents a very large share of their total external financing. And in fact, it can represent over half, 56% of total external financing among foreign direct investment, portfolio flows, remittances. So the big question today is, how big of an impact can the tax treatment of ODA have on revenue generation and on the economy in developing countries? So these are questions that we're raising today, and I'll hand the floor over to Joe to jump into the next slides.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. First of all, checking since my problems in the last session, can everyone hear me? Yes, great. So yeah, as Rachel was saying, we've seen a lot of focus on tax incentives, tax exemptions elsewhere. And so the question is ODA different? And so historically, most of the big donors from the OECD Development Assistance Committee would probably have said yes to that question. They requested tax exemptions on ODA-funded goods and services for a range of reasons. To maximize the volume of aid dedicated to specific projects, to reduce the transfer of resources to governments where there were specific concerns regarding the governance, to remove barriers to the rapid delivery of emergency humanitarian goods and projects. And should just say that no one is suggesting, in terms of the humanitarian side, that there should be any change there. There's widespread acceptance that is an area where it makes sense to have these exemptions in place. It can make delivery much quicker and much more effective. It's elsewhere that the focus is on. And then the kind of final reason that's often cited was to avoid the excessive burden of compliance from poorly performing tax systems. So that's kind of the historic picture. But questions are being asked over whether those reasons continue to apply. I think especially in terms of that last reason on the previous slide around developing country tax systems. I mean, if we look at the evidence over recent years, developing country tax systems have improved significantly. If you look in Africa, you've seen the spread of semi-autonomous revenue services across the continent, which has had a huge impact in improving the administration of tax systems. The burden for compliance has definitely decreased in many countries. And indeed, as we may hear a bit more from Gregoire later, the evidence is beginning to grow that the compliance burden actually exists in applying these exemptions, but that burden is on the tax administration, as they have to have separate administration processes for some of these exemptions. And so we may be at the risk of ODA exemptions are hindering the further development of the effectiveness of tax systems. We also have the challenge in terms of we have aid effectiveness commitments, and one of which is to increase the use of partner country systems. because that can help improve public financial management and improve the effectiveness of government performance overall. But if we have tax exemptions for ODA, these enable country systems to be bypassed, and so we're not ensuring that the development assistance funded projects are bedding into those country systems, including the tax system. So we have those questions. We also have concerns about the use and impact of these exemptions, risks of market distortion. So when you have goods that are procured under development assistance coming in free from customs, exempt from other taxes, they can start to distort the market, especially where there is abuse of some of these exemptions, and you have goods that benefit from the exemption that then move on to the open market and essentially undercut others. So we have that risk of market distortion. Also concerns that exemptions are being claimed by those who shouldn't, and this is partly because of lack of clarity over the exemptions and who exactly is and is not entitled to them, enables people to claim them who probably shouldn't, but the system is so unclear that they are often not challenged. And this kind of brings us on to the point of why we are starting with transparency. And so there's a range of reasons why we here at the OECD have looked to try and increase the transparency in this area. Firstly is the donors committed to review their policies in this area as part of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. And so we need a way to track progress on this commitment. And we also need a way to hold governments accountable on whether they're meeting those commitments. But also by putting more data and information into the public domain, we can also help provide the information that can help those reviews to make governments be able to understand what is happening elsewhere, make more informed choices as they're looking at meeting their commitment under the Addis Action Agenda. And also, by increasing transparency, hopefully we can address that problem in terms of development actors who may not know how their projects are going to be treated, help tax administrations have the information to make sure they know who should and should not be entitled to exemptions, but also those who are bidding for projects to know exactly how they will be treated when the project comes to be delivered. And lastly, I just point out, Rachel started by looking at the situation in terms of tax incentives more generally. We should also look in terms of how transparency over tax more generally has been increasing. We've seen through things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, much more transparency around what is happening in the extractive industries. We've seen through various other initiatives, such as initiatives in the EU to require greater transparency of banks. We've seen voluntary disclosures from a large number of companies now in terms of what they're doing on tax. It begins to feel a little bit like the transparency around tax of development assistance is now getting substantially behind where other sectors currently are. And so we think that transparency is a good way to start to make sure that the development community is always being that leader in terms of the area of transparency and not seem to be falling behind. So I'll pass back to Rachel, who'll talk us through a little bit in terms of what our Transparency Hub looks like.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe. So last January, with the support of our members, we launched the first tax treatment of ODA policy hub, which is on our website. And we're pleased to say that today we have now collected 21 out of the 31 DAC members that are currently, the 21 out of the 30 DAC members that participated in the survey. Today there are 31 DAC members, and it represents over 80% of total bilateral ODA. And so this is a wide scope. We feel that this is a good representation of donor policies. We've collected these through first a survey that we launched. So asking members, when was the last time that you reviewed your policies on the tax treatment of ODA? What is your current policy stance? And what's the review process that's currently underway? And we see that here you can, if you go to the website, you can click on each of the individual countries that are listed here, and you have access to their country profiles. You have here also so you have within the country profiles then the data that I mentioned previously, just to highlight a couple of the main trends that we've seen. So a couple of the main findings, we see that 4 DAC members never or rarely request tax exemptions, and 3 only require exemptions in very specific cases. For example, we'll hear from the Netherlands a bit more about their perspective and approach on government-to-government aid and in regards to customs and VAT, for example. We see that, interestingly, in the past 5 years, we had 8 countries that have carried out reviews of their practices, and 4 countries that are today currently carrying out a review. This includes the European Commission, Canada, France, and Spain. So we see that our members are moving on the agenda, and we need to keep the momentum going. So we're very happy to continue the discussion now. I think then, yes, I think that's it then for the country profiles. Yes, next steps.
Yeah, and just to highlight a few kind of next steps in terms of where we hope this work will go, some of which we will do here at the OECD, and others, we hope others will also join in this. So we do think that there's still scope for further transparency. One issue is around the actual legal instruments that grant these exemptions. So the UN Committee of Experts on Tax had a recommendation that these should be made public. But as you can see through our hub, only 5 donors provide links to these instruments, whereas we know more actually do grant these exemptions. And so having the availability and public access to some of those legal instruments would be really useful. More information from the developing country perspective. So we're looking at what happens from the donor side. But there's definitely a need for more information from the developing country perspective. We'll hear a little bit more from the PCT and FERDI in terms of how they're trying to help address that. But we think there will be a need to do more. And then lastly, just to point out, again, the PCT will talk a little bit about some guidelines that the UN put together, that the OECD helped with the drafting. And there's some work to be done there to understand what's the impact of these been, and to what extent, where exemptions are granted, do they follow these guidelines? So we think there's definitely more work to be done in this area. On the hub, we do publish with links to all these kind of other reports and pieces of information as well. We try to make it a repository for all of the information that's available, and we hope that the hub will expand significantly in the coming years as others get involved in this topic and provide more information. So just to say thanks to all the donors who support our work in this area, and I will leave it there, and we will hear from the rest of our panelists.
So first we have from the, sorry, let me just pull up the list here. So yes, so Valerie from the Netherlands, you're first on my list. If you'd like to provide us with your perspective from the Netherlands on this issue. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the floor, and also thank you for inviting me to this panel to talk about our tax policy coherence for development. I don't know if I can see the slides here.
Give me 1 second. I'm just pulling them up.
Yeah. In the meantime, I'll introduce myself. My name is Valerie Schulte-Noordholt. I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, and specifically for the Department for Economic Development and Private Sector Development. I will give a talk about the treatment of tax policy coherence. I will also talk about, until a month ago, I was actually working at the Ministry of Finance in the Tax Treaty Department. So I will focus a little bit also on tax treaties and developing countries. but I will cover a lot of different policies regarding tax and development. So Dutch development cooperation policy is aimed at poverty reduction and sustainable growth in low capacity countries. But on its own, it's not enough. Policy in other areas, such as international trade and taxation, must be coherent with development cooperation policy as well. And the aim of policy coherence for development is to minimize potential negative cross-border effects of non-development cooperation policy wherever possible, and to maximize the positive effects. So first, I will discuss our policy coherence agenda of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Finance, some of the ways we work together, and finally, some of the results we have reached the past couple of years. So first of all, on request from the Dutch Parliament, we sent a yearly update about the actions we've undertaken on the subject of policy coherence. And we have been doing this since 2016. These actions are based on a policy coherence action plan that is focused on 3 themes. And one of those themes is tackling tax avoidance and illicit financial flows. We have also have policy focused on reducing healthcare inequality and reducing the Netherlands climate footprint. But I'll not go into that today. So on tax avoidance and illicit financial flows, the policy goals we've set are A, countering global tax avoidance, including reducing the use of the Netherlands as a conduit country through unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral measures, countering the global illicit financial flows, including corruption, making sure developing countries have good tax policies and systems for tax collection and are able to combat tax evasion, and making sure that developing countries are resilient to illicit financial flows and capable of countering illicit financial flows. So on the right on this presentation, you can see how we measure this. So we have a number of indicators for every goal. So for example, the first goal, countering global tax avoidance. You can see one of the indicators is the number of developing and other countries participating in the G20 OECD inclusive framework discussions. But another example, for example, a unilateral measure is the introduction of a conditional withholding tax on dividends in low tax jurisdiction and tax abuse situations. So we can go on to the next slide. You can also see, by the way, all these policies are also translated into English, and all the other indicators, you can find them on our website. They're all translated. So in 2021, we undertook a broad policy review on tax policy regarding developing countries and on the joint responsibility of the Finance Ministry and Foreign Affairs. And in this response, we agreed to intensify cooperation around inclusive framework and treaty policy. And the Cabinet has pledged that when Parliament is briefed, for example, on relevant international policy against tax avoidance, the Cabinet will specifically consider the position of developing countries and whether their interests have been taken into account. And the guiding principle is to apply generous policies to more specific provisions in tax treaties that are of interest in developing countries, but that are otherwise not part of official Dutch tax treaty policy. So this means that for certain tax treaty policies, exceptions are made for developing countries. And then also, this is all explained to Parliament in the explanatory note of a new treaty. And we will report on the commitments and outcome on the provisions which are of importance to developing countries. And in general, there's a close collaboration between the tax treaty department and the private sector development department in foreign affairs with regard to international tax policy. So apart from all these letters to Parliament, the letters on coherence and the policy review, we also have more practical examples. For example, twice a year we have a round table between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Finance Ministry, but also we invite NGOs and businesses to get together to discuss tax and development topics. And the Ministry of Finance also shares the mandates of treaty negotiations with developing countries with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Affairs is able to offer input on this. So then I'll go and talk about the results we've reached the past couple of years. So since 2016, we do not request tax exemptions on goods and services delivered as government-to-government aid. In that regard, we also welcome the recently launched tax treatment of official development assistance hub by the OECD. And this also applies for import levies, custom duties, and VAT for all new government-to-government projects since 2016. We have doubled our ODA funds for capacity building in developing countries to improve their tax legislation and tax collection. This is also part of the Addis Ababa Tax Initiative commitments. We have exceptions in the Netherlands tax treaty policy for developing countries. For example, the policy to accept higher rates on source taxation on interest and royalties. And we have insert anti-abuse clauses in bilateral tax treaties with developing countries is one of our priorities. Also, throughout the inclusive framework negotiations on the two-pillar solution, the Netherlands has been actively committed to an outcome that is mindful of the interest of developing countries and will continue to support developing countries in the implementation of both pillars. And what is also important to note that in the most recent Commitment to Development Index of the Center for Global Development, the positive effect of our tax policy coherence is reflected. So in 2015, so before we started this policy coherence, we were number 23 in the finance component of this index, and for 2021 we ranked as 7th. So I think we can see some improvements in this regard. I think, yeah, this is the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions maybe later.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie, for the really useful overview of the Netherlands approach to policy coherence for tax. I think we got a useful overview of the evaluation methods and the results that span across a number of indicators. So that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ashima Neb. From the Platform for Collaboration on Tax. And yes, as Joe mentioned, the PCT has financed the study by Ferdi, and we're happy to hear more summary of what the PCT interest is and activities on this area, and to introduce a bit the report as well. Ashima, over to you.
Just to let you know, I think Ashima's having connection issues, so she's trying to join us right now.
Okay.
So I don't know if maybe we can go into some questions just to kind of see if she can connect in the next minute or so.
Okay. Yeah, so if we have any questions from participants, feel free to write those in the chat. In the meantime, Valerie, if you're still with us, maybe we might just ask perhaps another question quickly about your intervention, just to get a little more detail. I don't know if you're able to provide on the review in 2016 about the impetus, how this was launched, how it fits in with the policy coherence strategy in the Netherlands.
Thank you for the question. So the policy coherence agenda was adapted in 2016 on request from Parliament. And since then, in 2021, there was a big review, and this review was actually undertaken by a different part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there is a kind of department in the ministry which conducts studies, and this study was specifically focused on tax policy. And in the study, observations were made about the old tax coherence plan in 2016. And because of those observations, the indicators that we used and we took the review into account, and then we changed the indicator. So I think the difference is that the indicators are much more comprehensive. I think first we only had 2 different goals, and now we have 4 different goals. I think I can give you a more extensive answer. I have to say, because I've been working here for a month, I can get back to you and give you a more extensive answer. But I think this is the basic thing that changed.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's extremely helpful to understand a bit, that a tax policy review such as this can result in concrete outcomes and in a shift in the way that we work. So that's great. I see now that Ashima is back online. Ashima, are you with us?
Yes, Rachel, and thank you very much. Apologies, I don't know why I got dropped out, but perhaps it's got to do with my connection. I'm working from Astana today, but thank you for your patience with this. And since I'm now connected through my phone, can I request you to put the presentation up on screen, please?
Yes, 1 second. Great.
Thank you very much. Greetings of the day to everybody. Colleagues, I'll begin with speaking to what the PCT is and its activities, and then I'll turn to the PCT's interest and role in ODA taxation. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the PCT is a joint initiative of the 4 major international organizations working in the space of domestic resource mobilization. These are the IMF, the OECD, the UN, and the World Bank. Through the PCT, the 4 PCT partners collaborate in supporting countries in their efforts to step up domestic resource mobilization. In particular, these efforts are directed at supporting developing countries, and the PCT partners do this by jointly producing technical guidance on critical areas of tax, such as the PCT toolkits, and they also disseminate these toolkits and engage with countries on tax reform strategies. Also, the PCT partners engage through dialogue and regular exchange on each other's activities, and some of the activities are organized under the work streams which are listed on the extreme right column of the slide on screen now. Now, while the PCT partners are represented by director-level officers who are the PCT principals, and they provide the strategic guidance to the PCT, the day-to-day activities of the PCT are steered by a technical working group, which is comprised of senior technical experts from the 4 partners, who are ably supported by the PCT Secretariat, which is hosted by the World Bank. The PCT is generously supported by France, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom through a trust fund. And these development partners, along with a few developing countries who are invited by rotation, endorse the PCT work plan through the Partnership Council. So that's a bit about the PCT and its structure. Let me now turn to the context of PCT's interest in ODA taxation. And Joe referred to this in his presentation earlier. At the conclusion of the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development, through the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, countries collectively declared that they shall consider not requesting for tax exemptions on projects funded by government-to-government aid, beginning with renouncing repayments of value-added taxes and import levies. This declaration gave impetus to the work on tax treatment to projects funded by government-to-government aid. And in 2021, the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters released 13 non-binding guidelines to facilitate the consideration of whether or not tax exemptions should be requested with respect to these projects, and if requested, how these should be negotiated, and where they are granted, how these should be implemented. The UN guidelines also encourage donor countries to refrain from requesting for specific tax exemptions, except in circumstances where the tax treatment is either inconsistent with internationally agreed principles, or there are concerns arising from the governance structure or the tax system of the recipient country. They also encourage recipient countries to assess the impact of these exemptions, particularly the impact on the revenue leakages, and also encourage transparency, that is encouraging both the recipient and the donor countries to periodically review and make public their policies regarding the tax treatment of aid-funded projects. Let's turn to the next slide, please. Now, coming to the PCT's interest, and this is also something that we heard of in Joe's presentation. There is, while there is the Tax Transparency Hub, there is only limited information available on the policies and practices of developing countries on exemptions to aid-funded projects, and there is further limited evidence on the impact of that these exemptions may have on the recipient countries themselves in terms of their revenues, in terms of the additional administrative burdens that the administration of the exemptions pose, or the additional compliance burdens that are posed on the taxpayers. Also, while clearly there may be opportunities for abuse and extension of exemptions to taxpayers for whom the exemptions are not intended, these have not been studied, and there are challenges for public financial management. And it is to address this gap that the PCT commissioned a study. And this study has been carried out by FERDI, and it is in the form of country case studies. The three countries are Benin, Cameroon, and Kenya. And these case studies share new evidence on the revenue impacts and the administrative and compliance burdens, as well as some of the spillover effects. I'll not go into the details of the outcomes of the case studies, because we have Gregoire, who's one of the lead authors of these case studies, and he's here. So I'll hand over to Gregoire in a minute. But let me just turn to the next slide to share the link of the PCT website for our colleagues who may be interested in knowing more about the PCT. So thank you very much, colleagues, for your patient audience, and let me hand over to our colleague Gregoire for the presentation on the findings of the case studies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashima. Thank you for the nice invitation. So I will try to present you. I have, I share my screen. So is it fine? Yeah.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I would. I'm in Bangui in Central Africa Republic, where beyond ODA is the taxation of the United Nations, which is an issue among others. But, okay, so I will maybe switch. I can present in French, yeah, no problem, or in English. Doesn't matter.
As you like. There's interpretation available. So if those who need interpretation, just click on the bottom for interpretation and select either English or Spanish as Gregoire turns to French.
Perfect. Thank you. Bon, je vais présenter en français, les transparents étant en anglais. Je vais pouvoir.
Perfect. Since my slides are in English, I will present in French.
Pardon. Donc, nous avons étudié
Therefore, we have studied
au Bénin, Cameroun et Kenya.
These situations in Benin and Cameroun and Kenya.
Et l'objectif, l'objectif était de revoir le système comme il était appliqué dans ces pays pour les projets.
Applied to the different projects in the different countries.
D'apprécier les dépenses fiscales associées.
What the data associated, and then
les pratiques dans ces pays respectaient les guidelines, les principes
different regimes in this country respected the UN guidelines, which have been recently published.
Pour un survol rapide, Il
And
faut
to have a
bien
quick overview,
considérer que
we need to
donc, on a
consider
les pays membres d'IACI,
that we
de
have the
l'aide,
member countries
OCDE, mais on a aussi la Chine qui
and
est
the
un acteur
OECD, but we also have
très
China,
important,
which is a
notamment au Cameroun.
very
Comme vous voyez, il y a
important
un engagement
actor. As you can
d'environ $1
tell
milliard
here, you see that
et
they are involved in about
de l'aide
$1
totale
billion
reçue.
and 44%
Donc
of
ensuite, vous
received
voyez
assistance.
les États-Unis, l'Europe, la Banque
Thereafter,
mondiale
we
sont
see
importants
the
pour le
US, Europe,
Bénin,
the
la
World
France,
Bank,
la Banque
which is
d'Allemagne
important
pour
for
le Cameroun,
Benin,
et puis de nouveau la Banque
and
les États-Unis et le Japon pour le Kenya.
the US and Japan, which are so important
Maintenant, si on
for
regarde
Kenya.
l'aide niveau sectoriel,
If we move to
vous voyez
sector
que le
assistance, we
Cameroun, par
can see
exemple, a
that
une
Cameroun,
aide
for
importante en
example,
termes
received an important
d'assistance sociale,
assistance
d'éducation, de santé,
for
alors que le
education,
Bénin, vous
health
allez
and
avoir
population.
des
Well, as for
infrastructures
Benin, you would have
économiques.
more help on
De même,
economic infrastructure and services,
Kenya, nous avons
just as Kenya,
question de santé, mais également
where health
d'infrastructures économiques.
as well as
Important
economic
pour
infrastructures
connaître
are the
derrière le
most
système
important. This
fiscal
is
de droit
important to
commun qui
know
s'appliquerait.
the common
Si ce
law
projet n'était pas
that would
financé
apply.
par une aide extérieure,
This was not
mais
financed by
financé
the
en interne.
external aid, but
De
rather
même,
from
l'allocation de la Chine, enfin,
inside.
l'aide de la Chine va porter
And the
essentiellement,
help from China
principalement
will basically
sur
or
des activités
mainly
économiques
cover economic activities
rentables. Enfin,
which
l'investissement
are
dans le capital humain est bien
profitable.
sûr
The
rentable,
investment of
mais
human capital is of
la
course
marchandisation
profitable,
de ce service
but
n'est
the
pas aussi
commercialization of
immédiat que
services is
l'investissement
not
dans les
as
communications, dans le
important as
secteur
the
de
investment
l'énergie,
on
dans le
communication or in
transport
the
et
energy
l'entreposage,
sector,
comme
in
vous le voyez
transportation and
au
storage, as we
Cameroun,
can
au Kenya.
see for Cameroon and Kenya.
Nous n'avons pas regardé la
We
fiscalité
did
directe
not
associée
check
à
the
l'aide.
direct
Néanmoins,
taxation
je
associated,
remercie quand même le PCT pour sa patience parce que cette
but
étude a
thank you
été
for
menée
the
pendant la
PCT for
crise
its
du Covid.
patience because this study
On a
took
mis
place
beaucoup de
during
temps
the COVID crisis, so we
produire les
had a
données.
long time to
A priori, pour les
deal
trois
with the
pays,
data.
le système de
For
fiscalité
the three
directe est d'origine de
countries,
droit commun. L'impôt sur les sociétés,
direct taxes such as
l'impôt sur le revenu
taxes
est appliqué.
on
Il n'y a pas de
companies
dérogation
and on
particulière.
income was
Néanmoins, il faut
applied. There are
bien
no
intégrer le fait
special
qu'une partie de
changes.
l'aide est une aide
However,
liée
part
et
of
qu'elle
the
passe donc
aid
sous le coup
goes
des
through
accords de non-double taxation qui
the
les
double tax
tax
agreements,
les traités qui associent donc le
which
pays aidant avec
allow
l'entreprise
the
du pays
external
aidant
countries
avec le régime
to avoid to pay
avantageux du
taxes
traité de non-double imposition entre le pays aidant et
for
le pays
these
aidé.
double tax agreements.
Maintenant, nous nous sommes concentrés sur l'aide projet et notamment sur la fiscalité
We have
indirecte.
focused on indirect taxes and
disons
project
que
aid.
il y a des questions qui se posent sur les
And
exonérations.
therefore,
J'y
there
reviendrai
are
peut-être en
some
conclusion, mais
topics
effectivement, sur
which
les
are considered
infrastructures,
here
on a
regarding
ça relève notamment
infrastructure,
de la fiscalisation des marchés publics. Les
which
marchés
are
publics, en
also
général,
associated to the
procèdent
auctions
par des enchères,
mechanism,
des appels d'offres avec des
where we
mécanismes d'enchères
have
pour
bids
octroyer
which are
le
carried out
marché aux mieux
to
disant. C'est vrai que dans la plupart des pays, et il y a même un défaut dans la littérature académique, à notre connaissance, on n'a pas d'études. Ces appels d'offres se font toujours hors taxe.
Studies on these bidding systems, which are usually carried out without any tax consideration.
Comme si la réalisation d'une infrastructure hors taxe ou
Carrying
TTC
out this infrastructure
pas le
would
meilleur
not
disant, le
affect
mieux disant, c'est-à-dire le preneur de l'appel d'offres. Pour les dépenses sociales, éducation et santé, il faut bien reconnaître que dans ces trois pays, il y a déjà des régimes dérogatoires, des exonérations, notamment en TVA, de droit commun. Donc, que le projet soit en termes d'éducation de santé, soit financé ou non par l'aide extérieure, il n'y a pas de différence. Je veux dire, il y a des exonérations, mais celles-ci relèvent déjà du droit commun. En général, l'éducation et la santé sont hors champ de la TVA, par exemple.
So education and health
Le mode de
usually are
financement
not
de ce programme de santé ou d'éducation n'importe
covered with
peu
the
sur le
TVA.
traitement, à savoir
It's not
l'absence
really
de
important.
taxation. Alors, je vais regarder rapidement dans les 3 pays.
So I look quickly for the
Au
the
Kenya,
3
c'est
countries.
simple, c'est
So in
une
Kenya, it's
exonération
very
fiscale
easy. There
complète
is a complete
en
tax
matière de fiscalité
exemption,
indirecte
full
j'entends.
exemption.
Donc, le Trésor
And the
essaye d'établir
Treasury
une liste très détaillée des
tries
biens
to list
importés et des services
all
nécessaires pour
the
la réalisation du
imported
projet.
goods and the
Et cette
necessary
liste
services to
est
realize a
assez
project, and
difficile
that
à établir.
list
Enfin,
is
l'actualisation est
difficult to
assez,
create,
enfin,
and its
peut
update
engendrer des difficultés administratives significatives.
has several
Alors, c'est simple avec cette
administrative
exonération
difficulties.
complète.
And with this
Néanmoins,
full
on n'a pas du tout
exemption, however,
d'estimation
we do
des
not
pertes de
have
recettes et de la
estimates
dépense
of
fiscale. Il faut bien
loss
voir que
of
même le Kenya, qui utilise des
revenues.
dépenses
Kenya,
fiscales,
which produces
estime que ces exonérations liées à l'aide projet
revenue
sont
from
directement dans son
taxes,
système fiscal de référence. Donc, il n'estime pas les pertes de recettes associées
do
à
not
l'aide projet.
estimate the revenue losses.
Maintenant, le Cameroun a essayé de changer
Cameroon
son mécanisme et
has
donc
tried to
a essayé
change its
de basculer, on
regime,
va dire, d'un système ressemblant au
and
Kenya avec
is
une exonération
therefore moving
systématique à un
from a
système
system which
qui va se
is
rapprocher du
quite
Bénin,
similar to Kenya
où on va essayer
towards a
d'avoir
system
justement
which
une
is much closer
couverture,
to Benin's.
une
We are trying
appréhension
to have
du système fiscal de l'aide projet. Donc,
a
si vous voulez, les Camerounais,
cover
avec leur loi de finances en 2018 et 2019,
in
ont
the
essayé de
finance laws of
fiscaliser
Cameroon
l'aide projet.
2018 and
Néanmoins, cette loi
2019,
nationale
talking about taxation of project aid, but
était
this
limitée par des
national law
engagements
was
internationaux
limited
et des
by a
engagements
special
bilatéraux entre
international and
le
bilateral
Cameroun et la
agreements
Banque mondiale, le Cameroun et
between
l'Agence française
donors
de
in
développement, le
Cameroon, such
Cameroun et la
as
GIZ
the
allemande,
French Development
qui offraient
Agency, the
des
World
avantages
Bank,
fiscaux. Donc,
etc. This created
c'était
the
pas si
tax
simple pour le Cameroun
advantages.
de
And so
mettre
it's
en
not
place cette
so easy for
fiscalisation totale de
Cameroon
l'aide. Donc, ils ont mis en place
actually create
comme
this
mesure
tax
temporaire
system.
provisoire qui
Therefore,
malheureusement souvent risque de
as a
durer, un
temporary
mécanisme
measure,
de
they have
crédit
set
trésor,
up a
chaque trésor,
tax waiver
de chaque trésor,
mechanism
qui vise
which
à
is
éviter
directed
l'exonération, mais à ce
to
que l'impôt,
prevent
la
exoneration,
TVA, les
and
droits
so
de douane
that
soient pris en charge par
DA
l'État.
and taxes
D'accord?
and
Donc, le projet n'est pas
custom
exonéré,
fees are
mais le
taken over
prestataire du
by the
projet ou le
state.
financeur du projet n'a pas à
Therefore,
payer
there
la
is no
taxe,
exoneration,
l'impôt.
but
Cet impôt est financé par
the
l'État.
other partner of the project does not have to
Alors, il y
pay
a un
taxes because
gros
this is
problème
taken by
d'arriéré
the
dans
state.
ce
Of course, there
mécanisme
is
camerounais à
a
cause
huge
de règles
problem
budgétaires
of
assez
late
strictes qui
payments
contraignent
because Cameroun
d'un
has a
côté
very
l'enregistrement
strict budgetary
de ces
laws,
chèques,
which actually
de ces chèques
creates
trésors.
this,
Le système est
let's say,
reste
failure.
assez
The
complexe et il y
system
a
is
des
still
risques de
very
fraude.
complex, and there are lots of risk of
Alors,
fraud.
le Bénin, lui, a
Now
mis en
for
place
Benin
au niveau, alors a réussi à
created,
passer outre ce problème budgétaire. Donc,
they
le
went
Bénin,
over this
il n'y a pas
budgetary
d'exonération à
problem.
proprement
There
parler.
are no tax waiver
Donc,
in
que l'on soit
itself, no
clair, tout projet financé
exemptions in
par l'aide
itself. So all projects
sera
financed by
taxé,
international help will be
taxé au titre
taxed,
de la TVA et des droits de douane, notamment, des droits
VTA
d'assises.
and custom
Mais ces
fees
taxes
mainly,
seront
but
supportées
these
par l'État lui-même,
taxes will be
par
covered
ce
by
qu'on
the
appelle
state
des recettes
itself,
d'ordre. Alors, ça ressemble à
by what
des
is
recettes d'ordre, c'est
called
très difficile à traduire.
recette
J'ai mis
d'ordre,
quelque
which
chose
is
sur
very
le
difficult to translate.
recettes et dépenses d'ordre, ce sont des recettes et des dépenses qui
These are
ne
basically
représentent pas
expenses and
des
revenues
rentrées
which do
d'argent, ce sont
not
des écritures comptables
represent
qui permettent de faire un
income,
suivi,
but they allow
entre
for
guillemets,
a
des manques à gagner,
follow-up
on les
of
assimilés aussi à des
the
dépenses fiscales,
amount
même
to
si ça ne réduit pas
be
la pression
earned.
fiscale
It's very
per
complex,
se en
very,
soi.
very complex.
Mais voilà, on avait donc au Bénin, ils ont ce
Therefore,
système-là.
in
Il faut bien
Benin, they have
voir
this
que
system.
ils ont une mission, un
They have a
service au niveau de
mission, a
l'administration fiscale
service
qu'ils
at
appellent
the
la mission
level
fiscale
of
des régimes d'exception
tax
pour
mission,
gérer
and they call
ce
it as
système-là qui réunit
tax
l'administration fiscale, les
exception
douanes,
mission.
le trésor et
And
le budget. Il y a 17 fonctionnaires
there
sur,
are
ça
17
c'est à la demande des
agents
PO.
who are working
Donc ça
there, and
représente
this
presque
represents about
10% du
10%
budget de l'administration
of
fiscale pour
the
gérer
budget.
ces chèques trésors en termes de masse salariale et en termes humains. C'est loin d'être négligeable. C'est vrai qu'avec ce système-là, on limite le risque de fraude, ce qui est très difficile à estimer, mais encore une fois, et ça j'aurais pu le dire en introduction, c'est que tous ces régimes dérogatoires créent des risques de fraude. Les bailleurs ne savent pas comment si j'exagère un petit peu, comment leur numéro d'identifiant fiscal va être utilisé en douane. Un bailleur, il ne va pas avoir son relevé chaque mois, rarement, et donc avec la complicité d'un douanier, on pourrait importer sous l'égide de la banque ou de l'Union européenne ou de l'AFD des voitures et les revendre dans le commerce, en ayant la franchise de droits de douane et de TVA. Bref, donc avec le système béninois, on limite ce risque de fraude. Bien sûr, c'est coûteux administrativement, hein, et on accélère sérieusement les processus de remboursement, enfin en tout cas…
the risk of fraud is waived and
Maintenant,
of course,
il y a quand même, bon,
now,
on laisse dans le papier, je ne veux pas rentrer dans le détail,
I
mais
don't want to
on
go
ne
into
considère que la
detail,
TVA en
but
douane, on ne considère pas la
the
TVA
VAT
finale sur le projet
for
lui-même.
customs
Donc,
is
il y a une
considered not
couverture
the
incomplète, hein,
VAT
bien
for the
sûr.
project itself.
En matière de dépenses fiscales,
With regards to fiscal
vous voyez, les dépenses fiscales associées à l'aide projet sont de l'ordre
those
de
linked to
0,5% du
the
PIB
project
en
aid
total. Et vous voyez, elles sont réparties
on
entre
the
les
screen.
droits
They are
les
spread
droits de douane et la TVA.
through the
Pour le
customs
Cameroun, on est
right and
autour
the
de
VAT. For
0,7% du
Cameroon, it's
PIB. Et vous voyez, là, ça donne un
0.7.
rapport du FMI, on avait les autorisations pour
And
utiliser ça. Vous voyez ici, c'est des
as you can see
exonérations
here, there are
d'importation de micro-ondes, de téléviseurs,
exemptions
etc.,
of
qui relèvent de
microwave,
l'aide
for
projet,
microwave,
et
for
donc
TV,
qui
etc.
bénéficient d'exonérations de droits de douane et de
This
TVA,
beneficiate
et qui
from
pourraient être détournés
exemptions,
facilement de leur
VAT
destination,
exemptions,
pour être vendus dans le commerce
so they can be sold
et comment
on the
dire,
market and
détruire l'activité commerciale sur les téléviseurs et
then,
les
so
micros,
to
par
say,
exemple.
to
Alors,
destroy
le
the
détail,
commercial activities of
et
the company.
en revanche, au Kenya, malheureusement,
In
comme
Kenya,
les
on
exonérations
the other
fiscales sont
hand,
dans le
as
système fiscal de
the fiscal
référence,
exemptions
il n'est pas possible d'avoir une estimée des dépenses fiscales
in
associées.
this situation, it's not easy to have
Bref, en
an exact situation
conclusion,
view of
dans
the
le rapport,
situation. To
on
conclude,
fournit aussi un exemple théorique. On a essayé de
there's
faire un
also a
exemple théorique.
theoretical example
C'est simple.
that I'd like to present
Je vous laisse
today.
le regarder si vous voulez et revenir vers nous. Donc, en conclusion, on a des
So
exonérations
to
complètes au
conclude,
Kenya. C'est
there's
très simple.
total exemptions in
Mais
Kenya.
c'est clair que c'est là où le risque de fraude et
The risk of
d'abus
fraud and
des régimes
abuse
dérogatoires est le
of
plus évident.
the unfavorable
Le
regimes
Bénin et le
is
Cameroun
the
ont essayé de
highest.
mettre
For
en
Benin
place
and
et de
Cameroon,
limiter
we're trying to limit
le risque
the risks
en
to
mettant
mitigate
en
them
place ces crédits, ces recettes fictives,
with
ces crédits, ces chèques trésors.
credits,
Encore une fois, le chèque trésor, ça sert à payer
with
les
the
taxes, les
treasury
droits dus à la douane
funds
par
to be
l'importateur ou le
paid to
prestataire
the
pour le
customs by the
bailleur.
importer.
Au Bénin, ça marche relativement bien, mais c'est très
In
coûteux
Benin,
administrativement.
it's
Au Cameroun, on a des problèmes de
working quite
coordination
well.
entre les différents
In
services
Cameroon, there are
concernés,
issues with coordination
en l'occurrence
between the various
entre le
services and
budget
departments
et
linked to
l'administration
budget
douanière notamment.
and customs
Quelles
administration.
recommandations pour aller plus loin? Bon,
With
idéalement,
regards
il
to
faudrait une taxation
recommendations
complète
to
avec des
go
remboursements.
further,
Mais vous le
we
savez,
would have
déjà, les
to
défaillances
have
de
some
remboursement des crédits de TVA limitent cette solution
tax
si
credit
simple.
refunds,
Une autre question qui se
VAT credit
pose,
refunds,
honnêtement,
and
et qui nous a
the
laissé
other
aussi
question
un
of the
peu
matter is
ouverte, c'est
something
que
that's
se
quite
passe-t-il pour les marchés
open.
publics lorsqu'on
What's
on
happening with
inclut la
the
taxe?
public markets
Pas du
when
tout évident que
the
le
tax isn't
mieux-disant
there anymore?
soit le même TTC ou hors taxe.
So
Il
whether
serait bon
this
de
is
considérer, ça,
side of
les
VAT or not,
principes
and
des Nations Unies l'a
of the
introduit,
principles of the United Nations
le projet en tout cas de réforme des
apply
accords
here.
documents de Cotonou pour l'Union européenne
The
le considère aussi,
reform
c'est
projects
d'établir
of
une liste
Cotonou
négative de biens qui en
aims
aucun cas ne
to
bénéficieraient d'exonération, même au
have a
titre
negative list of
d'aide
goods and
projet.
services which could be
Par exemple,
exempted
dans
or
les accords de
eligible to
Cotonou,
the
pour l'UE,
voucher
c'était pour les pétroliers.
mechanisms
Ils ne pouvaient pas
in certain
bénéficier
countries
d'exonération de droits de
linked
douane ou
to
de TVA, ce qui est loin des négligeables, sachant les consommations de produits pétroliers
some countries
dans les pays
use a lot
comme
of
base taxable formelle.
this type of
Et enfin, bien
products.
sûr, améliorer les systèmes fiscaux dans les pays receveurs, notamment réduire
Petroleum
les
products.
droits d'enregistrement qui sont
So
souvent
we want to
excessifs,
reduce also
droits de
well,
douane
improve some taxes
sur
in
le
recipient
matériel, les biens
countries
d'équipement
to do
qui
with
sont
the
trop élevés.
tariffs.
Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you for your attention.
And go back to English,
And
of course.
now we're going back to English.
Thank you very much to you both. to all of our panelists. I think this has been a very enlightening discussion, presenting the perspectives of both the donors' attempts in reviewing their policies in response to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the multilateral system in trying to fill the gaps, to coordinate across ourselves, and then to ensure that we have the recipient perspective fully accounted for. And so thank you, Gregoire, for the presentation. I think this is really rich analysis, and I hope that this can be extended in other countries, and that we can have a broader coverage of the extent of tax policies. I think we have roughly 5 minutes remaining in the session. I don't see any questions in the chat for now, but again, please feel free to add those. You'll see that we've added a link to the PCT, to the study, to the PCT website, to the study that Gregoire has presented, as well as to our tax transparency hub. And I think that going forward, we should definitely keep this space, keep careful attention, because we see that there's movement on both sides, from donors and recipients, and that there's a need to better understand how these tax incentives for the tax treatment of ODA goods and services impact tax revenue in developing countries at a time where resource mobilization is increasingly constrained. So it's been my pleasure to help co-host this session. I don't know, Joe, if you have any other final remarks you'd like to make.
No, just to add in terms of thanks for everyone for being part of this session and for the work that's gone on. It's it's a complex and sometimes slightly controversial subject to wade into, and we're grateful that more and more people are dipping their toes into this water, and we hope that through more research, through sharing the results of all of that research, we can have a much better discussion in terms of what is the right way to treat ODA with respect to tax. I think Gregoire's presentation is great to show how you can take different approaches in different countries, and there's pros and cons across different ways. And so I think the more we can share this information and get that better understanding and improve the situation for countries that are facing challenges, I think there's we're only going to do better as we continue. I think the commitment in Addis really kind of kickstarted this work, and it's great to see more and more people every year engaging with the topic. So I hope there'll be many more in the years to come.
Great. Thank you again to everyone. And I guess we'll finish up with a couple of minutes to go. Enjoy your afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.